Good afternoon, everybody. And we'll wait. I think we are all just seeing a few more people coming in. So let's wait a little bit. Welcome to everybody. I see it's going up for 74 people. Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to everybody on this webinar, which we labeled Global Value Chains, Trade and Investment in Russia in a Post-COVID Reality. So I will be moderating this session today with, of course, a nice panel of people, which I will introduce in a minute. My name is Tom van Woensel. I'm a professor at the University of Eindhoven in the Netherlands. I'm also a professor at the Antwerp Management School in Belgium, and I'm also director of the European Supply Chain Forum, hosted in the Netherlands in Eindhoven as well. So I will be moderating this session, as I said, and I just want to make sure that if that I get a sign or some feedback whether everybody can hear me. So if you could somehow indicate in the chat that you can hear me correctly, that would be great. So you can find the chat. So if you can just give me a sign that you hear me, perfect. Thank you very much. That at least I see a subset of people saying yes, so that's great. So again, it's we are setting up this, of course, this webinar with the idea is that we would like to get into discussion with you in terms of how do we see that this post-corona reality will be shaping up. Clearly, we are seeing a lot of issues. We see a lot of discussions about how our supply chains are organized at this moment in time. We see a lot of value chains setting up into a certain way, and we have been doing this already for the past 30, 40 years in a probably similar way as and we might have been doing this even the coming 30, 40 years in the same way. Of course, there is now a extremely large disruption popping up, which we of course see. And the question becomes a bit, what are the opportunities there? How can we learn from this crisis, and how can we leverage on these opportunities in the best possible way? Obviously, it's also interesting to figure out and to discuss what are the opportunities for Russia? How are the combinations on EU and Russian trade? How can we actually work on that together, and what can we learn from that in that setting? So that's the idea, what I would like to learn together with you, how we are going to, at least what we can do in that setting. So first some practical stuff as well. We are doing this event with a simultaneous interpretation. So there is an interpreter available, and he will switch between Russian and English depending on who's talking, obviously. You can find this interpretation in this globe icon at the bottom of your control panel, and if you click on it, you will basically hear either the English one or the Russian one. Of course, you can select the Russian one, and then you will hear me. You will hear the translation into English and vice versa. So obviously, you don't want to turn off the original track, because otherwise you don't hear anybody, or you only hear the interpreters. So please, you can experiment a little bit with that, so that it is so that you can follow at all times, depending on which language you prefer. I hope that you all found out about the function and the functionalities. Before we get going, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bardon. He is the head of the Trade and Economic section of the EU delegation to Russia. Laurent, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. And indeed, I'm Laurent Bardon. I'm the head of the trade section of the delegation of the European Union to Russia. and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. Tom said the most important elements. Maybe let me repeat two or three. First is indeed global value chains over the past 30 years have brought consumers quality products at a cheap price, and it helped pull out of poverty a number of developing countries. So it has worked very well. But with the COVID, and in particular the shortage we experienced in personal protective equipment as China was first hit by the virus, discussion started. Should we not make our value chains more resilient? Should we not even produce at home? And of course, this debate is very relevant for two close economic partners as Russia and the EU. EU companies are the first foreign investor in Russia. They employ here, they produce here a lot. And Russia and the EU are very significant trading partners for each other. So what will come out of this reassessment of value chains? Should we regionalize them? And of course, we are neighbors, so there could be a lot of benefits potentially. What would be the role of public authorities? We hear a lot about localization. But if so, how do you reconcile localizing and exporting? Indeed, if you don't import, it's very difficult to export because you will always find a competitor who is using the global resources who will produce something better than any individual country can do on its own in isolation. So it may be more about being an open economy or a closed economy. And for Russia, it's certainly a very timely debate, as we saw that relying on oil is less sure than before, and as the threat of climate change is more visible and needs to be addressed. So as diversification becomes more necessary, it might be the right time also for Russia to insert itself in global value chain. So that would be my first few words to say why it is so relevant for Russia and the EU. And I'm grateful to all our great panelists, whom I leave to you to introduce, Tom. And thank you very much. And let's have a fun debate, as you were saying.
Okay, good. Thank you, Laurent, very much for your nice words. Before we get started with the panel, I would also like to raise your let's say attention to the point that there is a Q&A button at least where you can put in any questions you would like to put forward to us. And obviously we might even at a certain point also indicate some voting kind of mechanism. So please, once this is needed, we will let you know, of course, as well. And if you use the chat in the Zoom, then there are two options. You can choose the speakers only, but then it also means that only the speakers receive the messages. So if you think it's better to use speakers and participants, then basically everybody will see your question and comment popping up. And I and some other people will keep an eye on all the questions and feedback. And at a certain point, we will bring this feedback to the attention of our panel, and we will ask their opinions, of course, as well. So please don't be shy and use the chat function as extensively as possible. And we will try to manage this as good as possible so that we can bring it to the attention of our panel. Having said that, I would like to introduce to you our panel. Today we have 4 panelists. We have Beata Javorczyk. She's Chief Economist of the EBRD. We also have Pavel Isayev, Advisor to the CEO of Severstal. Alexander Knobel, Head of International Trade Department at IEP. And we have Markus Ozegowicz, and he's the CEO of Volkswagen in Russia. Each of the panelists actually prepared a short presentation in terms of sharing their views on the topic of interest of today. And so we will basically have the time that each of them can present their views. And then if you have questions, do let me know. And then after all the presentations, or if there are short questions in between, we will see how to move forward. But please put all the questions you have on the chat, and I will manage the flow of events. So I would like to ask Mrs. Javorcik to start her presentation, and she has the floor now. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. So let me set the stage by talking about the global trends and general opportunities they create for Russian-EU cooperation. So you have all heard about global value chains and rethinking of the global value chains. Very early in the pandemic, the world has realized just how dependent we are on China. So for instance, in Europe, about 90% of active pharmaceutical ingredients are imported from China and India. So COVID has drawn attention to vulnerability of the supply chains to shock. Of course, COVID is not the first shock that the value chains have experienced. In 2011, an earthquake that hit Japan was felt as far as the United States because Japanese firms manufacturing cars could not get their components from Japan and had to stop production. However, back then, this earthquake was viewed as a one-off event, an event that did not merit a response. But this time it's different. It's different because we have not one shock, but two. On top of COVID, we also have a lot of uncertainty about trade policy. We have the US-China trade war, which has not finished yet and could reignite at any moment. And also, each of the two shocks is likely to come back. As we are experiencing the climate change, we are likely to see more extreme weather events that may be disrupting global value chains. And there is a good chance that globalization will be scaled back and that uncertainty about trade policy will continue and will be magnified. So this is going to lead to rethinking of global value chains. Very early during the pandemic, there was a survey done among Japanese investors in China. And about half of them said they experienced disruption to their supply chains. But only a quarter had plan B. They basically relied on a single supplier and had no other plan. And I think this is what's going to change. The pendulum will move away from just in time to just in case. We'll be thinking more about resilience. We'll be thinking more about building in redundancy and diversification of the supplier base. And I think firms will be pushed to do that by their shareholders as well as by their credit rating agencies. So this means that we may see some reshoring, and reshoring may be possible because automation makes labor costs less important. So it may be possible to reshore quite a bit of production. But of course, complete reshoring is not an answer. You don't want to concentrate production in your home country. The whole point of building resilience is to having a diversified supplier base. And that's precisely what creates an opportunity for Russia, an opportunity for cooperation between European firms and Russian firms. That's because of geography, because of proximity, and because of the large size of Russian labor force. The other question that's on everybody's mind is, will globalization be rolled back? We actually asked this question during the financial crisis. There was a lot of fear that it would happen. But it didn't happen, and it didn't happen for two reasons. First, because the scope for increasing tariffs is quite limited. It is limited by the WTO agreement, by preferential trade agreements, but primarily it didn't happen because very early on during the financial crisis, the international community, G20, expressed very strong commitment to free trade. This time, such a commitment is lacking. We find ourselves in a world where the World Trade Organization has been weakened. It has been weakened by the US-China trade war, which is being fought outside of the organization. It has been weakened by much lower engagement from the United States. Also, early in the pandemic, we saw export restrictions on medical supplies, even within the European Union. We saw export restrictions on agricultural products, including in Russia. India also introduced temporary export restrictions on paracetamol. So that was also something that caused concern. But the concern coming from these export restrictions is not about restrictions themselves, but it's about the message they send to the world. They play into the book of populist governments that may use these export restrictions and as an excuse for introducing protection. And the public that still may remember those shipments of protective personal equipments that were stopped may actually be very receptive and may believe that countries need to build resilience through protectionism. But that would be exactly the wrong thing to do. And in the current situation, it would be very easy to introduce protectionism even in a way that is legal under the WTO rules. The WTO rules allow for countervailing duties on imports that are subsidized. But these days, pretty much every country is helping its own firms, which means that it will be very easy to make an argument that any imports are subsidized. And this escalation of protectionism may happen precisely at the point when we enter the recovery stage and when we will be needing free trade more than ever to stimulate growth. And there is a real danger that in the absence of international commitment and action, the world will just simply slide into protectionism. We will sleepwalk into protectionism. So here, I am looking at the EU to take leadership on this front and reaffirm commitment to free trade. If you look at actual data on international trade, you already see a decline in trade happening in March of this year. This is relative to historical average. Here you see some data for France. In France, the decline was already happening earlier. That's because of the slowdown in the European Union. By March, value of French exports was 40% lower than the historical average for that month. A similar picture emerges for Germany. We also see Turkey not having much decline until actually really March, where exports went down by quarter. Similar picture would emerge for the US as well. Now, when you zoom into exports, you see that not all export flows are doing equally well. In times of crisis, uncertainty increases. And that means that firms are much more worried about the risk of non-payment for goods they are exporting or non-delivery of the goods they have prepaid. So there is a much larger demand for insurance. The EBRD is active in trade finance space, and we have already seen a big surge in demand for insurance. But if you look at the data here, I'm showing you the data from Turkey because Turkey was not affected very much on the supply side. Their lockdown was only applicable to weekends, so actually they continued producing. So you see that a lot of the impacts in Turkey would really be coming from the demand side. But what you see there is that Turkish exports on so-called cash in advance terms, otherwise known as pay and pray, that the goods will arrive, went down by 40%. That's a huge decline. Now, exports on so-called open account, that's the situation where the exporter ships the goods and hopes to get the payment later, went down by almost a third. However, exports that are insured through letters of credit registered next to no decline. Similarly, exports on so-called documentary collection, which uses bank intermediation and provides some insurance, have done also better. And this is important because if you recall, if you go back to the great trade collapse of 2009, you can attribute 10% of decline in exports back then, declining global trade, to the inability to insure exports. Now, what is different now is that we have less trade finance available than before. That's because since the financial crisis, many relationships between correspondent banks and their emerging market clients have been cut. Many banks have withdrawn from that space. To a large extent, it is driven by the burden of anti-terrorism, anti-money laundering regulations. And that means that there is a lower supply of trade finance. And that means that trade can potentially be hit more during this crisis than it was before. Another implication of this observation is that intra-firm trade will do better. So multinationals trading between their various subsidiaries or subsidiaries and headquarters, which are not facing this uncertainty, they will be at an advantage relative to other firms. So the playing field will be tilted towards advantage being with multinational firms. My final point pertains to remote work. The trend towards remote work was already present before the crisis, but there was a lot of hesitation. Managers were very doubtful whether workers working from home would be working hard. Workers were concerned that if they don't go to the office, they don't see their boss, they will be passed over for promotions. But COVID has thrown many businesses all over the world into remote work from one day to another. And now, many weeks later, businesses know whether remote work works well for them or not. And I believe that many of them will continue with remote work. They will change the way offices are set up, and perhaps workers will come once a week or maybe once every 2 weeks of this office. But once you have crossed the psychological border, this psychological threshold of remote work, why limit yourself to employees in your own country? So why firms in Paris or Berlin should be hiring only French or German workers? Why not think globally? Of course, there are some limitations. You probably don't want to hire people who are many time zones away from you. There may be limitations related to data protection regimes if you're handling sensitive information. There is the issue of travel restrictions. But nevertheless, this is an opportunity for countries with inexpensive skilled labor to actually start exporting labor services. Because globally, we have exploited most of the benefits that pertain to differences between production costs. So the next frontier is really services. It's exploiting differentials between skilled workers located in different places of the world. And this is, again, I think, great opportunity for Russia. So to close, every crisis creates some opportunities. So let's not waste this crisis, and let's think about ways through which Russia, in cooperation with Europe, can turn this crisis into something good. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. Indeed, never waste a good crisis, huh? So that's important. Thank you for your views and insights. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Isaev for his presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to start expressing my gratitude to organizers of this event, and especially for Embassy of European Union. It's not the only event, but a line of conferences that provide ability to understand each other better, to clarify some ideas and details. And it's definitely, I hope everybody who join now in this conference shares the values of free exchange of ideas and continued dialogue. Since we talk about Russia, we agreed with my colleague Alexander continue our presentation in Russian. Два слова про мою позицию.
Two words about my position.
Я работаю в компании Северсталь.
I work at Severstal.
И я буду строить свою презентацию
And I will build my presentation
стальной отрасли.
on the basis of my experience in the steel industry.
При этом Северсталь традиционно очень вовлечена в вопросы.
In summer, Severstal is actively involved in the process of production.
Председатель совета директоров и основной акционер.
The chairman of the board of directors.
Профильного комитета ВРСПП.
And also the core shareholder of the company is also the member of the Russian Industrialist Union.
Значит, что мы видим в мире?
What do we see in the world? What's the current situation?
Это достаточно сильный стресс.
The world is experiencing a serious stress, and this applies to all the countries.
Поскольку стальная продукция является началом цепочки для других.
The steel production, the steel products, for many industries, is the beginning of the chain of production as a whole. It's the source of production.
Проблемы в
машиностроении. We see that following the steel industry, it is the machine building experiencing major difficulties.
Достаточно резко падали уверенность закупщиков.
There was a sharp decline in purchases, in procurement.
Затем мы видим, что тенденция изменилась на нашем рынке стальном. И,
but then slowly we see that the situation is changing. Of course, we're not talking about the quick, fast recovery. It's probably not possible. And it is not the problem of the industry per se. It is the external factor that influences the situation in the industry.
Является то, что мировая торговля уже на протяжении нескольких лет
the global trade
находилась под стрессом.
Is for a number of years has been under severe stress due to the trade conflict between the United States and China and the protectionist measures taken by the United States.
Способности и нашей индустрии особенно, и в целом экономики
the ability of our industry and the economy in general to restore
достаточно большие риски того, что не будет.
Shall not be neglected.
Мы видим серьезный рост заболеваний.
And we see that there is a serious threat.
Pavel, I need to interrupt a little bit because it seems to be that the sound is not perfect, or at least it seems to be that there is something with the interpretation. Can you check whether you hear the English interpretation? If that is the case, you need to select the Russian channel, I think.
Yes, I should change it, but I can see it's on the panel. Wait for a while.
So if you select the Russian channel in the globe icon, it should be okay. Sorry for the interruption.
So I'm back to you. I'm sorry for my technical malfunction. Now it's much better. We see that there are serious problems remaining as for the prices for the majority of the commodities and materials. The only hope is that the situation in China, which was the first to enter the pandemic and the first to exit it, is recovering quite fast, and the prices are restoring to their pre-crisis level. Maybe it's a hope for the industry as a whole. Still, we see that the demand has shrunk, and as a result, the industry is also reducing its production. A lot of production capacities are idling. There is a certain positive thinking about it, because we believe that we are at the lowest point and there is no further going down. So we will start recovering and picking up. We feel ourselves quite stable and resilient, and as the company is quite well prepared to the stresses. It is vertically integrated in Russia. We produce about 12 million tons of steel. We also produce pig iron. We produce coal. And we sell about 50-50 internally and externally. It adds stability to our company, because the decline locally resulted in that we started selling more for the experts. So we continue working, and we believe that it's a very proper approach in these conditions. We have to be very flexible, resilient in the products, in the markets. We have launched quite a strong transformation program that suggests close relations with the customers along all possible channels. And this allows us to provide additional value to our customers. Despite the difficult times for the business as a whole, we should demonstrate solidarity and support for the customers. And we should conduct our investment policy, assuming the future development and the perspectives. And we have already confirmed most of our investments, and we hope that the market opportunities that will start emerging will make us only stronger. What else is important for us in our vision? There is a significant demand for the services that allow us to use remote approach to document turnover. The customers can trace their orders, and they can see exactly where their orders are at the moment. Digitalization helps us a lot, and I think we can see that for the past 3 months, we communicate mostly through the digital network digital space, and the company managed not to lose its efficiently in these 3 months. We moved to the cyberspace, and we believe this is not only a trend in our industry, it is probably typical for other industries as well. We started selling our products via the internet, and the colleagues from other sectors, very different sectors from ours, confirm that we need government support, we need transparency, we need to use less paper, reduce formalities, and increase control. Digital technology help us. We need to improve our customs operations. This will create more transparency and better understanding in the market. The porting system, if we take Rotterdam approach, allows us to put the trading flows all together. Beata said that there will be financial services will be in demand. We agree with this. And we have to really think about this transition from just-in-time to just-in-case situation. Another thing that is of principal importance, and we probably will all agree to this, we need to avoid protectionism to the maximum. Of course, there are critical industries where the government is responsible before its citizens for the protection of these industries, and the protectionist measures have been taken. But if the pandemic spreads all over the economy, it will be much more difficult for us to recover independently than together. And we see that if we react by increasing the tariffs, we will only aggravate the crisis. We very actively take part in the works of various platforms, including ICC, the investment trading group B20, and we see that the group demonstrates common approaches between its members. We need to reform, we need to use additional functions, and business really wants to have a multilateral and transparent trading system. We have to pay more attention to the global value chains, not to be focused only on the goods and commodities, but on services as well. It means that the share of exports and imports that is covered by WTO is not really regulated properly. I think, and I want to believe that the global trend that really affects global trading and commerce is the matter of sustainable development. The companies should focus their efforts on sustainable development. It will continue affecting global value chains all over the world. In the short run, of course, we are trying to think what will be this the new world, the brave new world. But there is certain requirements posed by our society will move us to quite serious revision of the system of global value chain and global values. Thank you for your attention, and I'm done with my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you very much. Without too much ado, I would like to give the floor to Alexander Knobel, Head of International Trade Department at IEP. Please, Alexander, go ahead. Can you stop sharing the presentation, Pavel? Or sharing the screen? That Otherwise, yep. And Alexander, can you share? And you need to unmute yourself as well. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, I'm very glad to take part in this meeting. Like Pavel, I will speak Russian to move faster, but my slides will be in English. Собственно, я хотел бы рассказать про...
I would like to tell you about how coronavirus affects trade and investments. And this is the topic of my presentation. The colleagues have described the situation very well. And really, the global economy is quite in an unusual situation because there is a shock due to administrative measures related to the anti-coronavirus measures, and there is a shock on behalf of the demand. And this is added by the growth of uncertainty, as we all do not know whether there will be the second wave or not. We see a decline of prices for most of the commodities, and as Pavel already mentioned this factor, and this usually happens during the crisis. We see the capital outflow from most assets, from many assets, including the assets in the developing countries. The current situation really affected commerce and foreign trade, and for the core players, we see that there is a decline both on the export and the import side. The most dramatic decline is for India, and you can see here data for the first 4 months of the year. And the most impressive data we expect to receive from April, because April is the month when the factor of pandemic started playing its pivotal role. But India's decline is really impressive. The European Union has demonstrated quite a stable, though declining, level of trade, and not as dramatic decline as one could have expected. Various forecasts are being made regarding foreign trade and global economy. We basically all agree that there will be a decline, a substantial decline this year, and due to uncertainty of the following situation, we do not know what will be the trajectory of the economic development next in the coming years. We expect that most countries will experience declines in trading and GDP this year, as I said, and there will be a substantial, hopefully, growth next year. As for the investments, uncertainty plays the major role here, and we know that for direct foreign investments, certainty is the pivotal factor. In the early March, UNCTAD predicted FDI reduction by 15%. They have revised their forecast, and we expect that decline will be -30 to -40%. And of course, one of the industry that suffered the most is tourism. And we expect that the revenues in the year 20 will drop about by 40-45% versus the 2019 level. And this is because of the shock that people cannot travel, and there is administrative bans on travel. And of course, there are such countries as Italy and Germany are suffering the most because they also suffer from the tourism situation in the tourist sector. Madam Dvorak mentioned the trade wars factor. That's very true. The coronavirus and trade wars overlap and amplify each other. The factor of trade wars costs the global economy about 0.1% of the global GDP. And the countries participants of the war, China and the United States, suffer the most from its consequences. Meanwhile, the countries are looking the development of the situation and trying to analyze what will it be. And such countries as India, Turkey, Russia, and the European Union are introducing various compensation measures to somehow outbalance the US measures. The coronavirus pandemic becomes a factor in the trade war. In May, the US Congress made a decision to introduce sanctions against China just because the American administration believes that China incorrectly informed the global public and World Health Organization regarding the real state of affairs in its territory. This way or another, regional economic integration is not frozen due to COVID-19. 32 trade agreements are in this stage of discussion, though the process of discussion has slowed. That applies to the negotiations between EU and UK, EU and US, and the electronic format of negotiations is playing its positive role. And I think that the future will depend a lot on the stability of the supply chains in the trading agreements. COVID-19 also negatively affected the cargo transportation due to additional sanitary requirements. There is a stricter border control at the borders of the countries, also including the territory of European Union as a whole, and at the borders between Russia and European Union and within the European Union cost additional time and money for Russian and European consumers. And these delays are caused by a strengthening of the internal control in the territory of the European Union. Madam Dvorak described in great detail the practices and activities of WTO, and there is a lack of transparency that I would like to emphasize. And so there is a discussion regarding the status of the developing economy within the framework of WTO, because the way you treat the country, whether it's developed or developing economy, affects its position, a particular country's position in the WTO. So we need more transparency in the trade policies of particular countries, and if there are certain restrictions imposed, they should be of provisional nature only. Also, timely information is very important. Russia is not an exception here. of Russian foreign trade and imports have dropped about 20%. And the April data confirms this number. Our calculations and estimates show that about 14% out of this decline are due to the Russian currency devaluation, and about 6% are due to a decline in demand. This is how imports really react to the situation. Now, if we compare today's situation to the previous year's situation, devaluation of the ruble plays a very important role. The prices declined not only for the raw materials, oil and oil products, but also for most of the Russian basic exports. And this is a result of the shock of the global economy. So in these conditions, we forecast a substantial decline of the export revenues, and with a slight decline of imports, the balance of the current operations in 2020 will become negative for the first time in this century. I think the first time we experienced this situation was in 1995 or 1996. Also in 2022, balance will not restore to the previous levels. Same applies to the foreign trade turnover of Russia. If we look at various scenarios, most negative and most positive, still the decline is quite substantial. And in conclusion, global value chain in conditions of pandemic will be transformed. We see the experience of China, and about the experience of China is very important. And according to IMF, China supplies about 7% of the intermediate value added in global production. But the situation will depend not only on China, but on the external suppliers. We will probably move from the short-term economic efficiency, from the viewpoint of selecting the customers, in favor of stability of supplies and long-term guarantees of the transaction, probably to the detriment of the short-term benefit. I'm done with my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to give the floor to Markus, the CEO of Volkswagen in Russia. Mr. Ozegovich, the floor is to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you very much, dear colleagues and guests. And let me briefly present my point of view, which is actually not so different from what we have heard already, to leave then space for a discussion. Let me briefly describe the size of our business here in Russia. I'm the CEO of the Volkswagen Group here in Russia, which has in total 7 brands: Volkswagen, Skoda, Audi, Volkswagen Commercial Vehicles, Bentley, Lamborghini, and Ducati. And I have a second role. I'm also the group representative in Russia and the CIS, which then includes Porsche and MAN and Scania and all our other brands. I'm doing this job for 10 years now here in Russia. And basically you see on the left side is our footprint, about 400 dealers, 216,000 cars produced last year. And on the right side, you see that we employ directly about 6,000 people, indirectly via contract manufacturing agreement, another 3,000. And in our ecosystem, dealers, suppliers, which exclusively work for us, it's about 40,000 people in Russia. And a revenue of about 4.6 billion euros in 2019. And and imported goods of about 1.3 billion euros in 2019. And you see the difference. That's the local value add. Yeah? I think this is quite massive. So if someone says localize or not, we are massively localized in Russia already, and we have invested more than 2 billion euros over the last 15 years to actually achieve this localization. This does not include the investment of our suppliers. Like coincidentally, Severstal is on the call. They have actually built a stamping facility together with Gestamp right next to us in Kaluga. So that investment of their stamping facility is not even in this 2 billion. So the one thing which was already mentioned here, yes, we do have a COVID challenge, and I'll come to this in a minute. The biggest challenge right now for us is the oil price and therefore the resulting exchange rate. Yeah? The deviation of the exchange rate of about 10% to last year, that makes us really big problems, because of course we cannot hand on this into the market. This deterioration of the exchange rate, because otherwise Russian customers could not buy the products anymore. Now, I want to very much show you the COVID situation from our point of view, what happened. Yeah? I mean, first of all, we saw China and nothing much happened. Then we saw sort of Europe closing in the beginning of March and nothing much happened. And then the first time we had to close in Russia, our production was with the presidential decree on the shutdown. Right after that, we had indeed we couldn't restart because we were considered as a mission critical company in Russia, what the precise term was, I don't remember. So we potentially would be able to restart, but we didn't get components from our mostly European factories. Then we needed about a week when everything was sorted out. We needed about a week to actually install all the COVID measures in our factory, etc. And then we restarted end of April. Now the big question is: did the supply chain collapse? And my theory is the supply chain did not collapse. We had not a single delay because of transport problems, because of border problems, because of any supply chain issues. Yes, of course, several suppliers stopped supplying. Yeah? But that was not to supply chain issues. That was due to government shutdowns on the COVID situation. Now, funny enough, none of the Chinese suppliers stopped us. Yeah? They always managed to supply. And I mean, we of course, we don't have just-in-time supplies, because just-in-time supplies you never have over long distances. Just-in-time supplies you have always on very short distances, not longer than 2 or 3 hours away, because of course, otherwise you're dead anyway. Yeah? On the other hand, you also don't have just-in-case supplies, but because just-in-case supplies, that's classically our spare parts. So when you have a problem with your car, you go to your dealership to repair the car. Then we have huge warehouses to supply automotive spare parts. So that's also not the case. What we are doing is sort of somewhere in the middle, and we did not get interrupted from China at all. Yeah, we got interrupted when Northern Italy closed up. Northern Italy and Spain. That was our big problem area, where suddenly that affected our production in Russia. And furthermore, by the way, just as a funny anecdote, what is our biggest problem supplier for the last 3 months? They are coming from India, and it's not due to COVID, but they had a massive fire and they burned down to the grounds. So that was our biggest supply problem in the last 3 months, by the way. And why do I say this? Because I think what we all will learn is, of course, we need a bit more of a balanced supply and value chain, potentially setting up some double sourcing, but in different regions. Yeah? That's of course would also mean not to concentrate everything locally in Russia. And the one thing we really need to be careful is this emotionally driven localization policy making now, and the cocooning of the nations. That has to be avoided. We hear already from the Russian side, oh yes, see, you have to localize much more. Would you have just localized, you would have not been interrupted. It's not true. I mean, the president closed the country also for 4 weeks, so we would have been interrupted. And even the most localized car of all, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, is from my colleagues at Avtovaz, the Lada Granta. Even that was stopped due to some parts which couldn't be delivered from abroad. Yeah? So I think there is no reason to now ask for even more localization. And of course, emotionally, lots of governments say we need to localize more, we need to be more independent. I think it's the wrong thing. Because especially like in the case of Russia, we have already localized a lot, and you saw the difference between 4.6 billion and 1.3 billion. But still, more is simply not economically feasible due to the low volumes. Yeah? If we do that, of course, we have to cope with higher production costs, higher costs for the customers, and less product variety. And that is, of course, we don't want to give up. Yeah? So for the automotive industry, it's really essential that we stay globally networked. Okay, we might go away from a single source strategy more to a double sourcing strategy globally, in different regions. But that doesn't mean that we should go away from the idea of global supply chains and purchasing things on a global basis. So yeah, thank you very much for this, and I'm interested in all the questions and the discussion.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for your contributions, and also thank you to all the other panelists for their nice contributions. I have a few questions, and I have a few questions also coming from the attendees, and one of them is, of course, you always see a little bit of a field of tension between, on the one hand, profitability, on the other hand, sustainability, and one question is actually leading to is COVID-19 is the crisis we are seeing now, could that be also a sort of a catalysator in a sense to actually get more into green technology, sustainability, and moving forward faster in that area? And of course, is there any interest in a sort of on the interface, cooperation interface between European and Russian companies there as well? So the question is a bit: do you see possibilities in this area, in this technology push maybe towards more sustainability solutions because of the Corona COVID-19 crisis? Could that be seen as a catalysator? I'm not sure. At least I have to close something. I would like to ask this. Maybe Beata has something to say about that from her perspective.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's an excellent question. If I were to speculate, I would think that we are going to see divergence between North America and Europe. You already see that the US has loosened emission standards, for instance, for the automotive industry, as the economic situation worsened. And I think this push to relax standards in order to speed up recovery will continue in the US. While in Europe, in the European Union, I think we will use some of the large amounts of money that are being spent and will be spent to aid recovery to support green transition. And I think the crisis creates a great opportunity to build awareness among firms about climate change. I mean, if you go back in your mind to the ancient times of January 2020, Western press, European press was dominated by climate change as an issue. If you went to Davos, you know, the whole talk in Davos was all about green, green, green. But if you look at firms in countries where we as EBRD operate, so this is, you know, transition economies, Eastern Europe, former Soviet Union, you see that there is very little awareness among local firms of the need to do climate change mitigation. In a survey last year, we asked firms, if you haven't invested in improving energy efficiency, why not? And 2/3 of firms said it's just not a priority. But I think this is changing because we also saw in the data that firms that have experienced financial losses due to extreme weather events, which were much more progressive in terms of green management strategies. So I am hoping that we can use this crisis as the global community to build greater awareness of the need to engage in climate change mitigation. And I hope that, you know, European firms will cooperate with Russian firms on that front.
But yeah, just one question, because of course you could also argue, and because I had some discussions this morning also with around 15 companies about the what goes first now. Is it profitability or is it sustainability? So should we be back up to earning money again, let's put it like this, or should it be green? And it could be that some companies, so we asked, maybe just to give you an idea, we did a poll, what should be first, profitability or sustainability? And interestingly, this was 50-50. So half of the company said profitability goes first, and half of the other companies said sustainability goes first. And maybe the conclusion is it should be both, but that's something I'm now suggesting based on what I have been discussing this morning, of course.
I mean, that's quite interesting. So on the one hand, I think, you know, there's a lot of awareness that sustainability is good business. And what we saw, for instance, in our data is that multinational firms or foreign affiliates of multinational firms and exporters were much more active when it came to green action. And that's because they are under pressure from their customers in Western markets. On the other hand, if you think about, you know, voluntary standards, you know, corporate social responsibility, we have been waiting for decades, you know, for a lot of action on that front. And I think not enough has materialized. And frankly, on the climate front, we are running out of time. Yeah. So I wouldn't be surprised if this crisis brought in Europe tightening of regulatory standards, while at the same time, North America will loosen them. So there will be this divergence, in my opinion.
Okay. So I would also be interested to hear a little bit the company's perspective. So Marcus, do you have some opinion, or how are your views on this trade-off, or maybe it's not a trade-off, could be?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Somehow my neighbors just started drilling here, but I hope you don't hear it too loud. No, I think for the car industry, the setting is slightly different. I think we got the wake-up call in the car industry, and especially the company Volkswagen about 3 years ago with our diesel scandal. And since then, we are investing massively into electric cars. We actually introduced the first electric car in Russia 2 weeks ago. This is the Audi e-tron, and in Europe we will come by summer, by September, basically massively with our new model. So I don't think that COVID will add anything to that in the automotive industry, because, as I said, we got our wake-up call earlier. Yeah. And the fines from the European Union, the CO2 fines are going to be really immense for all the companies. So we have to go. And the idea of the supply chains, of course, for us, it's really the car is the biggest source of non-sustainable emissions, let's say. So that's our focus.
Yeah. Okay.
But of course, we do everything in factories and supply chains, and we have our targets, blue factory projects, whatever. But the thing is the product with us.
But okay, but it's clear that for you, COVID is maybe an extra push, but it's not the starting point of this quest for sustainability, of course. So if there are, just for the attendees, if you have questions, you can just plug them into the Q&A, and I will look at them and I'll try to forward them to the panel depending on the question, of course. I have another question, and I hear throughout all the presentations, sometimes I hear similar type of signals in terms of let's try to avoid protectionism. Let's not get into protectionistic kind of measures because the supply chain doesn't really, is basically would be hampered in terms of how it can be used in practice. We also see that. At least I heard that people were talking about we need cooperation, and I think Beata said that intra-firm seems to be less affected in terms of the crisis, in terms of COVID-19. So this seems to be that cooperation seems to be important to take into account. I also see that at least I saw it in various type of presentations coming back in various type of wordings that we need to cooperate or we need to better cooperate, and that we might be actually better to survive the crisis. And if I then hear the presentation of Marcus, it basically says something like, yeah, in a sense, the supply chain did not really have an issue because we basically were able to continue everything. But of course, the car manufacturing is quite tightly integrated already as a company and as a supply chain. So probably that's one of the better examples of supply chains. So again, I could also translate this as apparently cooperation seems to be valuable in mitigating the negative effects from a COVID-19 type of crisis or a large disruption like COVID-19. So, but of course, the question becomes a bit: if you do that, how can we enforce, or how can you basically get to cooperation? And of course, it's quite interesting because it's a cooperation in a multinational type of setting, or in a without having too much cocooning, as it is called by Marcus, of the nations, because we have to somehow counterbalance that effect as well. So I hear a lot of people saying about cooperation, or in various disguises about how can we cooperate better in the supply chain, or how can we cooperate better over countries. But I don't hear too much about how we can organize this into the future, and how we can move into that into a post-COVID-19 where we're all better collaborating, leading to value in the supply chain, very largely high level set. Maybe Alexander, do you have some views or some ideas on that from your perspective, or Pavel?
Да, ну действительно.
Yes, in fact, there is a serious issue, which is depending on certain particular company, including its international operations, cannot be optimal from the viewpoint of the global economy if all companies start observing environmental standards or production standards as a whole, that the overall situation will be better, will be improving. But for a particular company, including a global player, it can be maybe more beneficial not to observe such standards. So it's important to enforce the arrangements and mutual agreements. The companies must be controlled. I think WTO is not very successful in operating in solving these matters. There is a program for responsible business management, and in the OECD countries. So these standards are applicable to global corporations, and we see that these measures are becoming more and more efficient. Of course, there should be agreements and arrangements, commitments between the countries, particular countries, pairs of countries, and then they should spread international global level. If I may, I would like to add a few words. Regarding the previous question, I'm convinced that the green trend will be much more important for global trade and global value chain than COVID. COVID will definitely affect the situation, and the chains will consider risks more seriously than they did before. But still, given the development of digital technologies, I think the company's management system should include for more alternatives, greater number of alternatives, to be more flexible, to expand procurement. But as for the green trend, the Green Deal trend, no doubt it will be of more strategic importance, though it may be a little bit postponed in time. We are considering not only our participation in the production of greenhouse gases emission, we also considering this situation multifaceted. And Severstal signed agreements to enter the sustainable development programs, and we believe that this trend is so substantial for us. If you are not green, you will simply be kicked out of the markets, and the investors will lose any interest in you. We discussed this with our colleagues, and they say that this heavy industry, steel industry, coal industry are suffering from the shortage of young workforce. The young people do not want to come to work for heavy industries because they negatively affect the environment. That's a global change of paradigm in thinking, and this will affect the situation long term. Thank you.
So I think, Beata, you wanted to add something on the cooperation discussion. At least I saw you raising your hand for a while. Maybe it's...
If I may just quickly say,
yeah.
You know, many countries are now talking about increasing their resilience as a country to shocks like COVID. The irony is that by increasing local resilience, we will increase global fragility. So, you know, localization, trade barriers are not the answer. I think if we want to be resilient, we need to have strategic supplies, strategic stockpiles. Switzerland is a country that did not experience any food shortages during the early stages of the pandemic. You know, while the UK had empty supermarkets, that's because Switzerland has strategic stockpiling of food. It's run between the government and the private sector, and it costs about 10 euro per year per person. So that's point number one. The second point I want to make is that, you know, before the World War II ended, a year before, there was already Bretton Woods conference taking place, thinking about what world we want to live in after the war. We actually need another Bretton Woods conference. We need to think about what kind of post-COVID world we want to live in. And there are many issues to work out. One of them is global health monitoring, coordination of travel restrictions. How are we going to allow business travel? And of course, cooperation and trade. Let me stop here.
No, okay. I think it's very interesting because in a sense we need to think now about the world we would like to see afterwards. And of course, I think the same probably holds for also the supply chain setting. So what is the supply chain afterwards? And I think one of the points you also raised is Switzerland as a country did not suffer for food problems or whatever, or empty supermarkets, because they apparently had quite a lot of inventory in the supply chain, is my translation then. And it goes a little bit against the quite lean thinking and inventory reduction thinking and just-in-time thinking. And we seem to be, at certain points, we were a bit anorexic in the supply chain. So we were basically taking out all the fat in the supply chain. Or you could also think about this in any setting. There has been a lot of thinking about profitability goes first, and this is not necessarily the best if you have this kind of large pandemics or protecting yourself against uncertainty. And I think also Marcus was mentioning that it might be good to start thinking about a sort of a dual sourcing or multiple sourcing type of strategies, but also diversified in regions and so on. So there might be many aspects which are, of course, very relevant to start thinking about how would the supply chain be looking like after this COVID-19. And so one question I would like to put to everybody, and maybe to each of you, as a sort of a more finalization type of question. So I also have quite a lot of discussion that people say we are going to, with supply chains, we are going to a new normal, whatever new normal is. Everybody's talking about the new normal. And then many people say actually the new normal is actually the same as the old normal, because we are going back to our old habits, and we will be stuck to what we have been doing. And once COVID-19 is a little bit gone, we will go back to whatever we have been doing so far, especially in the supply chain. So that we go back to business as usual. You can also, of course, put it to a country level. Then at the end, we go back to the same way as we have been working together, as we have been collaborating, as we have been interacting with each other. So a question to you is, are you a pessimistic view or an optimistic view on the new normal? And that's the question I would like to ask to each of you. How do you see the new normal? Is that going to be really new, or is it just going to be, as we say, an old wine in new bags kind of thing? So Marcus.
Yeah, the new normal, you're right. A lot of people talk about the new normal, but I also think that it's maybe not so different when it comes to supply chains of goods. Yeah, because in the end, of course you would think more of a double sourcing strategy and these kind of things. And I would really hope that there's not too many other changes, because as I said, the new normal, also some people think the new normal is cocooning, especially as I'm just the Russian way of thinking was very much to go localize 100%, but that's not possible. I think where we have a new normal definitely, and Beata touched on this, is when it comes the supply chain of workforce, not the supply chain of goods. Because now everybody is really used to working from home and working remote. I think the only difficulty is be onboarding new people. Yeah? We have a few, unfortunately, one of our board members, not unfortunately, but maybe fortunately for her, she got pregnant and now she is in maternity leave, and the replacement is still sitting in Germany. Yeah? Of course, for the replacement, it's very difficult to get to know his team and to get into this. Yeah? But of course, that will be, I think, the biggest new normal is the way we work, the way that the labor supply chain.
Yeah. Okay. Good point, Pavel. Yes.
Colleagues, given what I've said, we are talking about the change in the civilizational paradigm, whether capitalism is a fair system. And of course, I believe that the issue of environment and the Green Deal will be growing in importance. And this starts affecting the market only if there is a political will and when there is a political will. And I think the business for many years has been repeating its calls to create a universal working system and to establish the rules of the game. But at the same time, we see that it is being torpedoed by certain forces in the governments of different countries. There is a Paris Agreement, and we are trying to fulfill this agreement and meet its requirement. But there is a very influential country, and its leadership believes that it's not that important, and it's not the priority to follow the agreements of the Paris Agreement. So it's a matter of passionality, of being passionate enough to take the responsibility on itself and try to move forward this idea, try to sell this idea to other people so that they follow you, follow these new trends.
Okay, okay, good. Thank you.
you.
Alexander?
Dear colleagues, it seems to me that we should assume that this will be a new normality, but what it will be the new normal? There are various hypotheses regarding this. What Pavel has said, I would rather say that we will probably have a recognition that there is no alternative to globalization. All the criticism of globalization, though a recent criticism, is based on that liberalization of trade, liberalization of capital flows, making global companies even more globals. Not everybody and not fairly benefits from these processes. And that's why anti-globalists have this organism, have these arguments to continue the discussion regarding pro or against globalism, but the decisions have to be made at a more global level. Otherwise, sustainable development of the economy is not possible. The role of the WTO must be amplified. The international organizations must have more power in regulating all these processes and coordinating all these processes of developing, especially in the health industry. WHO should regulate this. And therefore, I expect that the new normal will mean a rethinking of the role of international organization, their agendas, and there would be more given importance, more will be given to the greater coordination of international efforts and reduction of the national efforts.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Beata, the last word is for you then. Go ahead.
There is an intergenerational dimension of COVID. We know that in every economic crisis, young people tend to be hurt more. This crisis was no exception. Younger workers are more likely to lose their jobs. Mm-hmm. Young people who enter the labor market during a recession enter at lower wages, and it takes them years to make up the difference. It will be the younger people who will bear the burdens of debts that are being now accumulated by the government. And it will be the young generation that will deal with the effects of climate change. So I am hoping that this crisis will mobilize young people to become more active in the political process and change the narrative and change the focus and to promote green transition, among other things.
Okay, good. That's a nice vision of the new normal then. Let's have, but I think it's a nice words to end up with. So given the time now, I would like to yeah, close this session together. I hope it was interesting for me. At least I learned quite a lot of new things also in the interaction in terms of EU and Russia. So I'm quite at least it's good to learn something every time. So I did this. I would like to thank you as listeners, as attendees, to be part of this session. I would also like to thank all the speakers for being here and sharing their visions and nice ideas. I would like to thank the EU delegation to Russia and all and the interpreters for their hard work interpreting us in the two languages. So I would like to thank you all for being here, and I wish you all the best for the rest of the day and the evening, and have a nice week in the new normal, whatever that could be, and all the best from my side as well. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.